Thank you all. Can you hear me okay in the back? We got all the mics adjusted? All right, very good. Thank you very much, Gudars. It's a wonderful turnout tonight. I am a freelance journalist who has, for about the last 42 years, been filing for CBC in Canada, NPR, the San Francisco Chronicle, over the years, Christian Science Monitor, and various others. And one of the things, as a journalist, you figure out where you are in the feeding chain by how the people in power respond to requests for interviews. So just a matter of a few days ago, I applied to Yemen, to the government of Yemen, to interview President Saleh. You may know the dictator of Yemen. Now, this is one of those good news, bad news stories. Someone very high in his administration got back to me within 2 days, which is really unusual. Okay, well, the bad news was the answer was no. And now he's in a battle for his political existence, as are a number of leaders throughout the Middle East. As you know, a popular uprising got rid of the government in Tunisia, the U.S.-backed dictatorship there. The people of Egypt are rising up against Mubarak, another U.S.-backed dictator. It's a very, very exciting time. I'm going to go into that in more detail later in the talk. My book, Conversations with Terrorists, the full title is Conversations with Terrorists, Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire. And it profiles 6 leaders in the Middle East from countries as far apart as Afghanistan and Iran to Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Syria. But you'll note in there that America has managed to expand the definition of the Middle East. It used to go just from about Lebanon to Iraq or so, and then kind of Iran. Now it's all the way to Pakistan, right? That's all the Middle East now, thanks to the U.S. war efforts. And the book features a introduction by Robert Baer, a former CIA field officer in Lebanon. And if you saw the film Syriana, he was the George Clooney character in that. That was based on his book. And an afterword by Noam Chomsky. And so to the best of my knowledge, this is the first time that someone from the CIA and Noam Chomsky are all together in the same book, on the same page, as it were, practically. Anyway. My last visit to Afghanistan, I was going to travel from Kabul to Jalalabad. And Kabul, as you know, is the capital city. Jalalabad is near the Pakistani border in the far east. It's about normally 2-3 hour drive from Kabul. I work with a fixer who's an old friend now named Najibullah. A fixer is journalistic lingo for somebody who arranges interviews, transportation, translates usually, and generally helps out, does all the fixing for a journalist. And Najib told me one day, he says, Mr. Reese, the plans for the trip to Jalalabad are all set. The road is perfectly safe. It has not been bombed in 4 days. And with that exciting and positive news, I said, Najib, we've known each other for a long time. I know it's the tradition here, but my name is Reese Erlich, so just call me Reese, Very well, Mr. Reese. Will you be ready at 8 in the morning? Okay, so next morning, I change into my traditional Afghan dress, which is, you've probably seen photos or video of, it's a shirt that kind of goes over the top of the pants, baggy pants, a rolled woolen hat, and because we were going to be going through various government checkpoints, and while it was much less hassle if people thought I was Afghan. Let's just put it that way, and not an American. And once I was dressed like that, I can kind of pass for being Afghan. Just like in Iran, they speak to me in Farsi. In Iraq, they talk to me in Arabic, and I can't answer in any of those languages. But I just nod my head, and I can kind of slide by, right? But what was also really interesting is that Najib and the driver also changed clothes, because they in Kabul wear jeans and shirts and more or less like I'm dressed now, but they changed into a more traditional dress because they didn't want to stand out either. And then we got a really beat up old Toyota and then zoomed our way into Jalalabad, which was far safer than traveling in an MRAP or an armored Humvee or any of the ways the U.S. soldiers, which is like a magnet for attack, right? Low key is better. Now, as you leave Kabul on this road, there's only one way out to Jalalabad. And you drive along within a few minutes of getting out of Kabul. You're on a road where you look above you and there's about a 500 to 1,000 foot cliff, and below you there's about a 500 to 1,000 foot sheer drop. And you're on this ledge of road that's barely wide enough for a car to go in either direction. And you're winding around. And of course, this doesn't stop the Afghan drivers from driving like total maniacs. So you're on a two-road, there's complete logjam of traffic in both directions, and they're still crossing into the other lane to try and get ahead one or two cars and then zip back and until the giant truck comes at you and so on. Any of you who've been in Afghanistan will be able to testify that that's exactly how folks drive. And so what you really understand is why occupying armies have had such bad time trying to conquer Afghanistan in years past, whether it be the British or the Soviet Union, because one guy with a really big rock could stop a land army invading Kabul from that, because you simply block the road and that's it. There's no other way in or out. The reason we were going to Jalalabad was part of a story I was doing about the drug trade in Afghanistan. And it's illustrative of why the U.S. is losing the war in Afghanistan, despite all the propaganda we hear and all the optimistic statements coming out of the Obama administration and the generals and so on. Today, Afghanistan is the #1 heroin exporter in the world. 80% of the world's heroin comes out of Afghanistan. 50% of the entire economy of Afghanistan is drugs, mostly heroin, a little bit of hashish. The official explanation that started with the Bush administration, continues with the Obama administration, and comes duly out from the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, and other major media, and then down to your local NPR affiliates or whoever you listen to. The official version is, oh my goodness, it's a tragedy that Afghanistan is so dependent on drugs. The Taliban is the main source of the drug problem. They control the drug trade, and they're using the money to fuel the insurgency, to pay for their soldiers, the militias, et cetera, and we have to stop the drug trade as part of stopping the Taliban. So I was going out to Jalalabad to speak with farmers who had used to be opium growers and today are growing citrus crops as part of a successful U.S.-led effort for crop substitution. Now, these guys are wonderful people, father and son team, been farmers for a long time, and they're farmers like you would find here in Oregon or in California or anywhere else in the world. They want to make money off their crops. And for a long time, opium was very profitable because it doesn't take much water. It's easy to grow. You just kind of throw some seeds out and they grow. They sprout up easily. And the drug dealers come by and pay you in advance for your crop. So you get in advance, you get to use the money, and then when it's harvest time, they come by, you harvest, and you give them the opium. And they had an interesting history that in the 90s, after the Soviet Union was forced to leave Afghanistan, they were growing large amounts of poppy. And when the Taliban came in, they continued to grow poppy. But in the year 2000, under a great deal of international pressure, the Taliban actually stopped poppy production in Afghanistan, cold, in a matter of months. They said it was un-Islamic, and they stopped it. And for about a year and a half, from 2000 until the time of the U.S. invasion, there was no poppy production, and there was no heroin exporting in Afghanistan. A rather major feat. You don't have to take my word for it. Colin Powell, then Secretary of State under President Bush, offered to give $45 million in aid to Afghanistan for the good work that they were doing in stopping the heroin production. The only place in Afghanistan that was continuing to grow poppy and produce heroin was a small sliver of land in the northern part of the country controlled by the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance were a group of warlords, Mujahideen, who had fought the Soviet Union, who were continuing to fight the Taliban. And they funded their militias, their guerrilla forces, with the drug money, because it's very lucrative. You can put together a brick of pure heroin, and that's worth a whole lot on the international market. It doesn't weigh very much. So it's a very profitable form of industrial production, shall we say, or agricultural production. So the U.S. invades in October of 2001, right after 9/11. Al-Qaeda attacks the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon. The U.S. invades, allegedly to stop, in retaliation for the attack on 9/11. But if you stop and think about it, why do you invade and occupy an entire country who had nothing to do with 9/11 to go after a small group of people who were responsible for it? That was obvious at the time. But most people in the United States got fooled by the argument because people were angry at what had happened on 9/11, and they supported, at least initially, the war in Afghanistan. Within days of the U.S. invasion, the farmers were growing poppy again. Within months, Afghanistan was back up to being the #1 exporter of heroin in the world. And who was doing it? The Taliban were on the run. They were all in disarray because they had been defeated militarily by the U.S. Al-Qaeda, certainly, they weren't involved to begin with, and they certainly weren't involved now. Those guys, remember the Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance folks in the north of the country? They moved their operations down to Kabul, and because they were the U.S. allies to kick out the Taliban. And they were the cabinet members and the military leaders under Karzai. And they went, oh boy, before we only had control of this little sliver of land. Now we've got a whole country. Oh boy. And up and running was the heroin production within months, with the full knowledge of the United States of America. With the full knowledge. How do we know this? Because I was writing about it at the time. I was one of the few reporters in January of 2002. I was writing about this and subsequently wrote about it, but it never made it into the levels of the media that it could actually have some impact. It was in small dailies or in alternative media and stuff like this. But the reason, the U.S. is perfectly happy to cooperate with drug dealers if they're pro-U.S. And later, subsequently, articles came out in the New York Times. The CIA leaked data showing that they had known about it from the beginning. Again, I cite in the book, the time and place of all of these articles. The New York Times and the CIA admitted it because they wanted to go after Karzai. They were having some arguments with Karzai, and they wanted to discredit him. So they showed the drug connections of all of the various members of his cabinet, including the former Minister of Defense, who loaded an entire cargo plane full of heroin and shipped it to Russia, and came back with an entire cargo plane of cash. About $6 billion a month in cash leaves the Kabul airport. They have to note it. I'd love to be the guy who counts it, wouldn't you? 1, 2. Okay. So the $6 billion leaves the Kabul airport every month because their banking system doesn't really function. So you can't wire transfer it like sophisticated drug dealers do. You got to carry it out in cash. And a lot of that money is the drug money. And it's controlled, it's done by the Karzai government officials with the knowledge of the United States. And the U.S., again, how do I know this? I went in Kabul to visit the head of the UNODC. The UNODC is the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. It's the official UN body that follows the drugs issues and human trafficking and all major international crimes, and they have an office in Kabul. And I sat down with very nice gentlemen. They do reports twice a year about the drug trade. They do aerial surveys. They have a very, very good handle on the drug trade in Afghanistan. And I, whoops. Sorry about that. My voice is getting a little croaky. So I said, I asked the guy, the head of the UNODC, how much of the drug trade in Afghanistan is controlled by the Taliban? And he went to his computer and he gave me some figures and we did a little long division. 3%. 3%. Now, where have you ever read that in any of the major media in the United States? You can really dig. It's very interesting. The CIA gave the figure of 2.8%. I actually dug it out of a small New York Times article buried in the back pages. There was congressional testimony by the CIA. So it's not a secret, but it's really embarrassing. Because I then proceeded to ask this UN official a question that apparently no other American reporter had ever asked. Well, if the Taliban control 3%, who controls the 97%? Oh, and that's where the embarrassing answer comes. And basically, it's the U.S. allies. And the official, or not the official, but the excuse that's offered by the U.S. is that, well, there are no Mother Teresas in Afghanistan. That's an actual quote. There are no mother. In other words, you got to deal with the people who are in power. Does this sound at all familiar with a Mubarak or a Ben Ali in Tunis or you name your favorite dictator, right? Which is we always say, well, the only guy we can work with just happens to be the corrupt, woman-hating, human rights abusing, ethnic cleansing promoter, right? Somehow or another, we always end up with those. Once in a while, I'd like us to find a Mother Teresa. Anyway, so the 97% of the drug trade is controlled by criminals and the U.S. allies, with the full knowledge of the United States. So then you take a step back and you wonder why things aren't going very well in Afghanistan. When I was there at the beginning of the war, just a matter of months after the U.S. invaded, people really hated the Taliban. And a lot of people were favorably inclined to the United States because the United States had gotten rid of the Taliban. They had no direct experience with the U.S. That has changed. They now have direct experience with the U.S. And the U.S. is an occupying power. The minute the U.S. decided to invade, it had to occupy because it can't invade and then turn over the government to anybody that the people might choose. You have to have a pro-U.S. government there. And you put a pro-U.S. dictator in power and let him hold elections every once in a while and call it an emerging democracy. You have to understand the terminology that we use, right? If you have an actual democracy or a country that actually holds votes and changes its constitution through normal means, but they're critical of the U.S., well, then they're a horrible communist dictatorship. Asterisk C Venezuela, right? Okay. So you just have to keep your terminology straight if you're going to really understand U.S. foreign policy. It's just like the term terrorism. If you don't like the U.S. and you use militant tactics or certainly armed struggle, well, then you're automatically a terrorist. Whether you're Al-Qaeda, you're Hezbollah, you're Hamas, you're Marxist guerrillas in Colombia, or Basque nationalists in Spain, you're automatically a terrorist. And on the other hand, if you are the Mujahideen who fought the Soviet Union and you blow up movie theaters because it's un-Islamic somehow to watch movies, or you assassinate professors that you don't like, or you throw acid in the face of women because women should not be going to school, well, you're welcome to the White House and called a freedom fighter. I'm not making that up. Gulbuddin Hekmakhtyar, the guy who was responsible for that stuff, the most reactionary of all of the Mujahideen leaders, was welcomed to the White House by Reagan and called a freedom fighter. And same if you're a Contra in Nicaragua who intentionally killed civilians and doctors and teachers, is part of the fight against the elected government in Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, well, then you're also a freedom fighter. So the U.S. knows the U.S. hypocrisy knows no bounds in this regard. Now, one of the more fascinating chapters and experiences in my book was going to Iran. I've been there now 4 times. I helped arrange Sean Penn's trip there in 2005. Those of you who are from Iran will undoubtedly be able to tell me every detail of his trip. It's become lore. I've met Iranians years later who swear they know everything he did, and I was actually with him, so I can tell them that they're wrong. But anyway, that was one of the trips. And the most recent trip was in 2009 when I went to cover the presidential elections, which resulted in the fraudulent election of Ahmadinejad for his second term. And I was there when the big demonstrations started taking place. Estimates run from 1 million to 3 million people throughout the country, a massive uprising of popular support. It wasn't organized by anybody. The Green Movement, the leaders, the opposition leaders who had run against Ahmadinejad certainly had no control. They were as surprised as anybody by the massive outpouring. It's instructive, the kind of people who came out, because it's very similar to what we're now seeing in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and elsewhere. At the time, the people came out because they felt their votes had been stolen. But as the demonstrations gained momentum, you saw kind of 2 trends developed, one of which believed in the Islamic constitution and the Islamic government, but felt that the current leaders had manipulated it, by stealing votes, by repressing people, by jailing people, had distorted the goals of the Islamic revolution. Other people felt, no, the core of the problem is the Islamic constitution itself, and that you need to return to a parliamentary system, something like existed under Prime Minister Mossadegh prior to the 1953 coup. And everybody kind of coexisted side by side because the goal was to get Ahmadinejad out of power. And had they succeeded, then that debate and struggle would have continued afterwards. When I left Iran, I went to Iraq, actually, to continue some additional reporting. And the Iraqis were, they all, the minute they heard I had been in Iran, they all wanted to find out what was going on. Because what they said traditionally is that when you get rid of a dictator in the Arab world, you have a coup. And in Iran, they have mass demonstrations. Well, that's proving not to be true now. It was a bit of an exaggeration, but that was a common sentiment. Now, today, we see people, the so-called Arab street, people of the street, and we see a similar debate and struggle taking place, which is that these are not people led by a particular political party. They're not part of a political tendency, whether an Islamic tendency or other socialist, communist, whatever. These are ordinary people out in the streets angry at the dictator. Where the revolution goes from here is still very much up in the air. We hope that it goes in a positive direction, that there can be genuine free elections. The U.S. is doing everything it can behind the scenes to scramble to put in some pro-U.S. military strongman. Remember, see previous examples, which is that we're not for democracy, we're for pro-U.S. governments that can occasionally hold elections, maybe. And if they're fraudulent and they turn out the right way, okay. If they're free and fair, they turn out the wrong way, well, then you denounce them. Yeah, you're a bunch of terrorists, right? Hamas wins the elections in Palestine and immediately undercut and attacked by Israel and the United States. Karzai in Afghanistan holds not one, but two sets of fraudulent elections, one for president and one for parliament, and we're still recognizing and dealing with the Karzai government. So I think I'm actually this is a very exciting and optimistic time in the Arab world. Unlike, I don't know of a single, maybe you know of somebody, I don't know of a single person who's predicted what is now going on. I think this caught everybody by surprise. The demonstrations, maybe not the demonstrations, but the fact that the Tunisian government was replaced came as a big surprise and a very positive one. And the struggles are continuing because, of course, the old elite might be willing to get rid of the top guy in power, but the rest of them want to stay in power. And it's not just the fact that they're power hungry and enjoy their villas, but they know if somebody else comes into power, they may well end up in jail for all the fraud and corruption that they've been perpetrating and the repression that they've been perpetrating for years. So there's a strong incentive to stay in power if they possibly can. Shifting to another part of the world where I also wrote about, I last year went and interviewed Gula Cohen, a name that may not sound quite right in a list of terrorists, right? And I suspect many of you don't know who she is, although if you're Israeli or Palestinian, I'm sure you do know, because she's quite famous there. She was best known, she's now 83 years old. I visited her and interviewed her in her house in Jerusalem. She was best known as a supporter of the Hebron settlers and a member of an ultra-conservative party in Israel in the 70s and 80s. And the Hebron is a Palestinian city in the West Bank. It was a group of mostly American Jews who immigrated to Israel, came and seized some an apartment complex in Hebron, and then over a period of years gradually forced out the Palestinian residents in nearby areas, claiming that it was a security problem. And today about 150 Israeli families are protected by 2,000 Israeli soldiers in the middle of a Palestinian city. It's an outrageous example of the settler mentality, and she was one of the leaders of this. But she's been perfectly consistent because before 1948, when she was a young woman, she was a member of Lehi, or the Stern Gang. Now, the Stern Gang, you may or may not have heard of. If you've studied some of the history of that era, you certainly would know of them. But it's a history that's been disappeared from certainly for a lot of Americans. The Stern Gang was one of three Zionist groups fighting for independence from Britain. Remember, Britain controlled colonial Palestine at that time. The Lehi, or the Stern Gang, originated many of the terrorist tactics that today are associated with Muslims and Arabs. So, for example, they mailed letter bombs to members of the British cabinet, hoping to kill them. They planted bombs in East Jerusalem, hoping to kill Arabs in an effort at ethnic cleansing, to drive them out. They assassinated political leaders of the British. They killed Arab civilians. The UN at that time was trying to negotiate a two-state solution, and they assassinated the lead UN mediator to make that impossible. So these are if any Arab group had done things like this, they would be immediately denounced as terrorists. But in case you're wondering, Gula Cohen's autobiography, as was published in the United States, was the memoirs of a female terrorist. So that should clear up the question of whether she was a terrorist or not. Now, the most outrageous thing about the Stern Gang was that during World War II, the head of it, Abraham Stern, wrote a secret letter to Hitler offering to collaborate with the Nazis in return. Here's the deal that he proposed. That if Hitler allowed some Jews to leave Germany, he would join the Zionist forces with the Germans to fight the British in Palestine. Now, can you imagine anything more outrageous in the middle of the Holocaust to offer to cooperate with Hitler? That's how ultra-nationalist these folks were, and why they were hated by a lot of Zionists, let alone by the Palestinian Arab people of that time. By the way, I will, and I describe this in much greater detail in my book. In the time of 47-48, when Britain was getting ready to pull out and the fighting began between the Palestinians, Arabs, and the Jews in Israel, Arab forces also used terrorist tactics. They planted bombs in West Jerusalem in an effort to kill Jews and drive them out. So nobody's hands were clean in terms of using terrorist tactics at that time. So for a long time, the Stern Gang was considered just an extremist group outside the mainstream of Israel. And then in the 70s, one of their former leaders was elected prime minister. And one of their former leaders of another extremist group called the Irgun, he was elected prime minister. And all of a sudden, there's now a transformation. So that if you go to Israel today, the history of the Stern Gang has been scrubbed clean. You can find a museum dedicated to the Stern Gang in which you don't see any mention of the terrorist tactics against Arabs. It was all militant, armed resistance against the British. That's how they've scrubbed the history. You can find streets named after Abraham Stern in both Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. And so the lesson in all of this is the people who were terrorists at one time, if they come to power, they're suddenly no longer terrorists. And the U.S. knows this very well, and the U.S. is very cynical in its use of the term terrorist and who it accuses of being terrorists. You know that the term terrorist today is used like the epithet used to be, you're a communist. So in the old days during the Cold War, any nationalist, any anti-colonialist, any neutralist, any religious leader opposed to the U.S., you were automatically lumped together as a communist. And maybe even the communists were called communists. But today, it's the terrorists, right? The epithet is being a terrorist. Closely related to the issue of Israel and Gula Cohen and that history was a chance that I had to meet Khalid Mashal, the head of Hamas. Now, Khalid Mashal lives in Damascus. I had tried on numerous occasions to interview him. He's not the easiest guy to get a hold of. Let me just put it that way. I was unable to interview him. But on the last trip I made to Syria, I was fortunate enough, and it was the kind of thing where as a journalist, sometimes you just get lucky. So here's what happened. I was traveling there with Peter Coyote, who is an actor. You may know him, a political activist, a wonderful writer. He and I were traveling together to work on a different story, and we were invited to a diplomatic reception. The country of Bahrain was having its National Day. So we didn't have any formal clothes. We were mostly out in the countryside, bouncing around on dusty roads. So we had like leather jackets and khakis. Everybody's dressed in three-piece suits and very fancy clothes. And we kind of stuck out, but what the heck, we're just reporters. That was our excuse. So we saw this group of young women over in the corner, and it turns out they were soap opera stars. So those of you from the Arab world or Arabic speakers know that Syria is very famous throughout the Arab world for its soap operas. They're just as bad as American soap operas, but anyway, they're very famous. And the women were like throwbacks to the 1950s. They had like bouffant hair and with the hair curling under their ears, pounds of pancake makeup, rouge, lipstick. They looked like hookers after a hard night's work. And apparently they were very famous because all of the men wanted their pictures taken with the soap opera stars. Click, click, camera, phone, cell phones, Then they see Peter Coyote and they realize there's a real Hollywood star and they all are running over, Peter, can we take your picture? And blah, blah. So while this is kind of chaos is going on, I see over in the corner there's a guy standing there with a bunch of bodyguards around him. I said, Peter, I think that's Khalid Mashal, the head of Hamas. He said, really? And I said, yeah, come on, let's go over. Let's go ask him for an interview. He said, what? I said, lesson number one, kid, if you're going to be a journalist, you jump at the opportunity. You don't pass. This doesn't happen to you every day. So we go over there. We kind of have to work our way past the bodyguards and introduce ourselves as, American journalists, and we're in Syria. We'd like to do an interview. And with no irony, he says, I'm always happy to talk to Americans. And when are you going to, how long are you going to be here, whatever. Here's my office phone, call me. Now, lesson number 2 for those aspiring journalists in the audience. Never, ever just take the office phone, because they never call you back. Never, never. Could I get your cell phone, Mr. Mashal? Well, he doesn't carry a cell phone. Why? Because the Israelis have this habit of packing cell phones full of explosives and blowing people up with it. Ahmed, his assistant, he's got the cell phone. So he's the designated guy in case anything goes wrong, So we get Ahmed's cell phone. And sure enough, he followed through, and we got, a couple days later, we got the interview. Now, so this is pretty big deal for any journalist, right? And pretty lucky. So in the process of preparing for that interview, and also subsequently in researching my book, I went back and dug a lot more into the history. I knew generally about Hamas, having covered them before, but I really dug into the history. And it's quite fascinating what they stood for and what they stand for today, because there's a lot of misinformation about Hamas. Hamas had its origin as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was a conservative Islamic group out of Egypt, formed in Egypt, that went to various parts of the Middle East. Sheikh Hassin formed Hamas in the mid-1980s in the occupied territories. And it was the charter, and the charter's online, you can go back and read it, was explicitly anti-national liberation. They rejected the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which was the main Palestinian group of that time. They said they stood aside. They called for establishment of an Islamic State in Palestine. It's an openly anti-Jewish document. Now, and I don't use that term lightly, because I know anybody who criticizes Israel is accused of being anti-Semitic and being anti-Jewish. But this is an actual anti-Jewish document. It upholds the protocols of the Elders of Zion as a legitimate document. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forgery created by the Tsarist police back in the early 1900s as a means to attack Jews in Russia at that time. It's been exposed as a phony document for decades, but it's upheld in the charter as a legitimate document. It claims that Jews have fomented every war in the world since the mid-1800s. I mean, there's a lot of just outright anti-Jewish nonsense and propaganda. Now, you would think in the mid-1980s that a new group forms that is so openly anti-Jewish that the Israeli government would immediately crack down on them. You would think, right? No. Israel supported them. Israel supported them. They allowed them to receive money from Saudi Arabia. They allowed the Sheikh Hassin to continue to preach his message on Friday prayers and his mosque. At the same time, they were arresting, imprisoning, and torturing members of the PLO. Why would they do this? Because the Israelis are masters at divide and conquer. At the time, the PLO was strong. The next strongest group was Marxist parties within the PLO. And there was this teeny tiny Islamic group over here that posed no threat. So allow them to grow and let them attack the PLO for divide and conquer. Sometime later, the Hamas grew in strength, and they changed their policy, and they began to attack Hamas like they did everybody else. And of course, the irony of all this is that today, 2011, Hamas is the bad guy, the terrorist that you can't possibly talk to, and the Fatah group, which is the main party within the PLO, they're the ones that are okay. They're the good guys that we can talk to. So it's same divide and conquer, except it's flipped. So we got in to talk to Hamas, and I have to say, from the conversation. And so, number one, so the origins of Hamas, in my view, were thoroughly reactionary. It had nothing to do with either promoting Islam or national liberation or the interests of the Palestinian people. But it is also an organization that has grown and changed over the years. And Khalid Mashal is actually one of the more moderate leaders today. And in practice, although they've never formally rejected it, they don't follow the precepts of what's in the charter. They have now consider themselves a national liberation organization. They work with other groups. They won free and fair elections in the Palestinian Authority. They now govern Gaza. And by all accounts, I want to go back to visit Gaza again. I'm not sure how soon I'm going to be able to do that given the general turmoil in the area. But from all accounts, I've talked to Palestinians who live there. They're running Gaza more efficiently than the PLO did because at least they're not corrupt. That doesn't mean it's democratic or that they're respecting people's rights or anything like that. It just means it's functioning more and has got, in general, more popular support than Fatah did because of the issue of corruption. And probably the thing that was most interesting and surprising for Americans, when I talked to Khalid Mashal, he made it clear that Hamas would support a two-state solution with Israel under the certain circumstances. Now, that may come as a shock for those of you who have heard that Hamas wants to kill all the Jews and drive them into the sea, and they would never recognize the Israeli state, et cetera, et cetera. But he told not only us that, he said that to Jimmy Carter, he said it publicly to the BBC, and basically there is a consensus internationally, which everybody recognizes. Fatah, Hamas, all of the parties, what's left of the leftist parties and so on. In 2002, the Arab League put forward a proposal for a Middle East peace. Israel has to return all of the Arab land, that is the Golan, to Syria, which it annexed in 1967, a small strip of land called the Sheba Farms to Lebanon. It has to recognize a viable Palestinian state, not one that's crisscrossed and divvied up by settlements, etc., but a viable, complete West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And if those conditions were met, Israel would be recognized by the Arab states, and including by the Palestinian state. And the Palestinian state could live in peace side by side with Israel. And Hamas, while that's not their preference, has agreed to a long-term ceasefire if that was in fact carried out. And what Khalid Mashal pointed out is that it's not Hamas who opposes a two-state solution, it's Israel that opposes a two-state solution. And I think that's accurate. Now, again, if I was Palestinian, I would not vote for Hamas, because on all kinds of issues, whether it be women's rights, whether it be the role of religion in government, their general approach towards the role of government imposing moral issues, et cetera, I would find myself in strong disagreement. I think many people in this room would also find themselves in strong disagreement with them. I would vote for another party. The interesting thing about a parliamentary system, unlike the democratic United States, is you don't like a Republican, you have to vote for a Democrat, right? Well, in a parliamentary system, you can vote for a smaller party and your vote is not wasted, and you try to build up and increase the impact of and support of your small party. Okay. So you can do that in the Palestinian Authority and in most countries in the world that are far more democratic than the United States in that regard. So I would not vote for Hamas. But Hamas is a legitimate political force that is not going to go away. You can't, by calling them terrorists, you can't expect that, therefore, there's going to be some kind of a peace settlement. Fatah cannot make a separate peace settlement with the Israelis apart from Hamas's participation. It's just not real. And that's got to be recognized. And sooner or later, the Israelis will recognize that. I can't predict exactly how or when, but the PLO were the evil terrorists all the way up to the time of the Oslo Accords. The PLO were Hitler, were the Hitler incarnate. Yasser Arafat was never seen in a photo without a 5-day growth of beard. You remember those days? Every time, Mr. Evil looking, he always had a snarl on his face. Suddenly, the PLO had been in favor of a two-state solution for about 10 years prior to that. Finally, the Israelis came around to agreeing that, and suddenly the PLO are new partners, and Oslo opens up a new era, and Yasser Arafat is always clean-shaven in all the photos. So watch Khalid Mashal. If they don't kill him first, he's going to emerge as the new moderate leader of the Hamas that the Israelis can deal with. You heard it here first. There's lots and lots of other stuff to talk about. We can go into much greater detail about any of the countries there. I interviewed Ayatollah Fadlallah from Lebanon. I interviewed Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Haven't even touched on the Kurdish issue. You can go on. I'll allow you guys to choose which topics you want to get into. But let me just close by a short story. On September 14th was Reese Erlich Day in San Francisco. Thank you. I never thought I'd see it. I was used to picketing out front, and they welcomed me in, and I got suspicious. So I was honored for my work as an investigative journalist. And I don't know about you, but I've always wondered about whether these legislators actually read the resolutions that are put before them or read the laws. You've heard that they just sign it, right? So I decided to put them to the test. And they ask you to write the first draft of the Reese Erlich Day resolution. I read it myself. So I wrote, whereas Reese Erlich has been investigative journalist for over 40 years, whereas investigative journalism is under attack around the world, blah, 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 blah. And get to the end. It's therefore, be it resolved that the city and county of San Francisco recognize September 14th as Reese Erlich Day. And then I added, and this is absolutely true, be it further resolved that the city and county of San Francisco shall provide free medical marijuana upon demand on Reese Erlich Day. Now, as it turns out, they do read the resolutions because that part didn't make it into the final draft. And in fact, when I went up to get my little plaque, the councilman who sponsored it said, "Nice try, Reese." So what's fascinating about San Francisco, it is a liberal city. It's probably one of the most liberal cities in the country. And the Board of Supervisors is divided by people that anywhere else in the country would be considered pretty far out liberal Democrats. And then there's the folks to the left of them, the progressives, right? And there's lots of battles, and a lot of the battles have to do with local issues. So I was waiting. They fill me in the break. So the real issue, the place was completely jammed. There's like a couple hundred people. And the debate was over whether to allow a chain gourmet pet food store to set up a branch in a particular part of San Francisco. And there was a furious battle back and forth of pet owners, and I don't even know what gourmet pet food is. I had to listen. I was interested to try and figure this out. And so, well, we're against chain stores. Well, no, this place has just been sitting vacant. A big fight. Finally, they take a vote. 1 vote margin, huge. The losers are just furious and angry and stomping up and down. And then they go, and now we'd like to present an award during our break to Reese Erlich. So I get for it. So everybody's still in the room, right? So I start talking about the incredible cost of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that we're spending $1 million a year per soldier to wage these wars. That's how much it costs. So 100,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, 50,000 soldiers in Iraq, $150 billion a year. And the city of San Francisco is having to cut back fire service and health care and education because there's no money in the cities. And San Francisco, of course, is not alone. Cities and states across the country. What an incredible waste. And you talk about budget deficits, and nobody talks about the impact of this unnecessary and completely useless spending for war. And now the pro and the anti-pet foods for, that's right. Remember, this is San Francisco. And then I say, and we got to get the troops out of Iraq. Yeah, right. And we got to get all the troops out of Afghanistan. That's right. All right. So that's San Francisco for you, which is down with the empire, but don't mess with my gourmet pet food. All right. Afterwards, we held a reception at one of the supervisor's offices, and I invited various folks who had either helped with the book or contributed in some way or knew people I'd been interacting with. So we had labor leaders and Muslim Americans and Arab Americans and Israeli peace activists, and some Iranians, because, I had been talking a lot about Iran. And a lot of these folks were involved in movements in their own communities, but they had in fact, in most cases, no contact at all with the other folks, because everybody is off doing their own thing. So in 2009 and 2010, there were very big demonstrations among Iranians to protest the fraudulent elections in Iran. And a real grassroots movement developed in this country. But they didn't have anything to do with the immigration rights battle, right? There's a lot of Latinos demonstrating against the unjust deportations and so on, and for the DREAM Act. But they didn't have anything to do with the labor movement, who had its own big march in the fall, actually a very large turnout in Washington, D.C., but these different movements, and I understand for various reasons why that is, but at least the leaders, the more conscious people within these movements, should be interacting with each other, at least bring out a few Iranians to the next labor demonstration and a few workers to the next Iranian demonstration, or demonstration for Muslim rights, whatever it might be. Get out there and lay the groundwork so as the movement increases, people will be able to contribute and bring a much bigger movement together. Because arguing with the Obama administration isn't going to do it. If I went tomorrow and sat down with President Obama and presented everything in my book, it would have zero impact. But if there was about 1 million people outside chanting, it would have a different impact. And I think that's what it takes. That's what it took with the Bush administration. The Obama administration is no different. A majority of Americans oppose the war in Iraq. They oppose the war in Afghanistan. But they can be ignored in Washington because they're not an organized force. It's a diffuse force. And I hope that Reese Erlich Day, in a very small kind of way, was a start in that direction to bring these different movements together. And I hope you join with me in making that a reality. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a presentation by journalist and author Reese Erlich, talking about his latest book, Conversations with Terrorists, Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Reese Erlich has been working as a journalist for over 40 years. He first worked as a staff writer and research editor for Ramparts magazine from 1963 to 1975. In addition to teaching journalism for many years, he now works full-time as a print and broadcast reporter for such networks as National Public Radio, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Radio Deutsche Welle, KQED Public Radio of San Francisco, and the California Report. His books include The Iran Agenda, The Real Story of U.S. Policy and the Middle East Crisis, Target Iraq, What the News Media Didn't Tell You, co-authored with Norman Solomon, and Dateline Havana, The Real Story of U.S. Policy and the Future of Cuba. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Reese Erlich spoke at the Multicultural Center at Portland State University on January 28, 2011.
What do I think of the divestment and sanctions movement as a pressure tactic against Israel? And the second was one state versus two states. Okay. I'm old enough to have been around during the period when we were fighting against apartheid in South Africa. And one of the factors that helped bring down the apartheid government was the divestment movement and the pressure internationally brought on South Africa. It wasn't decisive. The people of South Africa themselves rising up was decisive. But the external pressure did a lot to help. And I think that applies to Israel as well. So I think there's no question about that. On the other question, I'm very familiar with the debate, so I won't try to go into a long discussion about it. But here's something to think about. The argument goes something like this. The Israelis have rejected a two-state, so why not go for the one state in which Jews and Arabs, or Jews and Muslims, or Arabs and Israelis would live in a unified state, and there would be democratic rights, and you vote for who you want, and you have one Palestinian state. All right. Well, that's the kind of leftist progressive view of what a one state would be. But I've traveled in Lebanon and in Syria. And when you talk about one state to the refugees there, they talk about, their concept is all the Jews got to leave. I've been told all the Israelis have passports for some other country anyway, don't they? So they can leave. And all we Palestinian refugees living in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere come back. And it's because it's our land. It's been our land since 1948. That's their version of a one-state solution, which, as you can imagine, is not going to go over real well with the people, with the Israelis living there. And, of course, they don't all have passports. There are now 3 generations of people who've been born and raised in Israel. And we can debate, and in my book, actually, I try to go back and look at what happened in 46, 47, 48. I won't get into a lot of that now, but the reality is Israel is an existing state today. The Jewish people of Israel aren't going anywhere. And as a matter of fact, they're the dominant military and political power in the region. So it's rather absurd, and in fact it's counterproductive, not to mention immoral, to talk about kicking them all off. It ain't going to happen. And so the version of one state, it's hard enough to convince Israelis to have 2 states. A genuine 2 states, let alone to go for one state. All it does is get Israelis mad and make it impossible to have a 2-state solution. So as difficult as it is, as intransigent, particularly as the current Israeli government is, I think a majority of opinion in Israel would favor a 2-state solution under certain circumstances. And that question has to be, and basically the Israeli government has to be pressured to live up to its commitments. And that is the international consensus. The question was, to comment basically on the mass demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt and what it means for the American empire. Well, I'll tell you this: they're staying up late in the Pentagon tonight. It's got them worried. It's got anything that keeps them worried is good news, right? So those of you who are pessimistic and say, "Oh gosh, look at the elections," well, there's lots to be optimistic about. There's people around the world, and successful uprisings around the world have an impact back here at home as well. So I remain optimistic. I think basically the U.S. was concerned about Tunisia. They're really worried about Egypt. Because Tunisia, on the big scale of things, is not as important to them. But Egypt is a linchpin in the Arab world for the U.S. policy, everything from its policy towards Israel, economically, politically, etc. And if Mubarak falls, they're working overtime. I'm part of a list of Middle East experts, and they're already floating names of who could take over from Mubarak. This is how the people in Washington think. It's like the last thing we want is like free and fair elections because the wrong people might win. So how about so-and-so? He seems to be, he's a general who's got a popular following, and that's how we came up with Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq, by the way, was that kind of thinking. So I think we're in the midst of it now. Bring me back in a couple months, and we'll talk and analyze it. But at the moment, I'm very optimistic about the potential for very significant change in those countries.
The next member of the audience asked the author for his description and thoughts about Mohammed el-Baradei, one of the figures emerging as a possible leader in post-Mubarak Egypt.
We're talking about Mohammed al-Baradei, the former head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. I've actually interviewed him. He's a very sharp guy. And I have to say on that, because he came under incredible pressure from the Bush administration to say that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and they had a nuclear weapons program. And he said they didn't. He took an incredible amount. They tried to fire him from his job, and he stood up to that. They tried the same thing about Iran. They tried to say, no, well, Iran, obviously they have a nuclear weapons program. He said no. While he was head of the IAEA, they raised all kinds of questions, but he never said, and the IAEA never said, that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. He's also been out of Egypt for a whole long time. And so while he's very well known internationally, I'm not clear how well known he is in Egypt. We're gonna find out. I mean, he was very courageous. He flew back into Egypt. He was shot at with water cannons and had to take refuge in a mosque. He's now apparently under house arrest. That's what I know. So, I'm sorry? He's under house arrest, at least according to press accounts. I suspect, though, that people who have been living in Egypt, engaged in the day-to-day fight, have people whose names we may not even know are going to show themselves in the weeks ahead.
The next member of the audience asked where Saudi Arabia was putting their resources.
They put their resources in oil. Where is Saudi Arabia putting their resources? They love to meddle in the region. They are seen as and indeed are closely allied with U.S. policy. So Ben Ali, the Tunisian dictator who fled, he went to Saudi Arabia. That's where he's staying now. Just like Idi Amin, you remember the old Ugandan dictator? He fled and died in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is becoming known as this refuge for the dictators of choice, right? So they, in general, have backed all of these dictatorships and have made alliances with them for their own interests and at the behest of the U.S. How Islamic are these uprisings, and how will that affect the relations, Israeli-Palestinian relations, or Israeli-U.S.? Okay. You have to go country by country. And contrary to Gudar's earlier statement, I don't know the answers to everything. And so, as far as I can tell, and I have to say, I've not been to Tunisia, I've not been to Egypt, so I'm just going based on the research I've done and a few people that I've talked to. Apparently in Tunisia, by all indications, it was a secular movement and or one of moderate advocates of Islam. There were none of the what I would call ultra-conservative parties that adhere to Islam. In Egypt, it's very interesting. The Muslim Brotherhood, which does have a base and had won seats in parliament until the most recent elections because they were rigged, they didn't participate in the first demonstration. But now they are. Yeah, they chose not to participate in the first demonstration, and then I think they realized their mistake, and now they're back out on the street. But if you look at the photo, so it's very impressionistic, but in the photos I've seen, in the video and so on, there's some women with a hijab and some without. And if it was predominantly Muslim Brotherhood, for example, the women would be veiled. So you have to kind of look at those, but I think it's very much in flux. I think you got to be really brave to get out into the streets of Egypt right now, because you're taking your life in your hands. And I think those who struggle the hardest are going to be the ones who end up having some influence in the next government. And I think we don't know yet. Sure. Describe a little bit more about what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and so on. I've been to Israel 7 times. I've been to Gaza, I think, 3 or 4 times, and the West Bank numerous times. So I've traveled a lot throughout the region. And there's no question that well, let me take a step back. Someone asked me last night, why would the Israelis are absolutely opposed to ever giving up East Jerusalem? So what makes you think that they ever would? Because they've had to give up other territory before. They were in Sinai. They had to get out of that. They were in southern Lebanon for years. They had to get out of there. And they were in Gaza. They occupied Gaza, and they had to get out of there. They got out of Gaza because the cost of occupying Gaza was too great in terms of a huge number of soldiers protecting a small number of settlers, and the cost in lives and money, etc. But just getting out didn't mean that they gave up. So they then basically isolated Gaza. As you know, it's a strip of land on the Mediterranean. If you've ever been there, it's actually spectacular views. I mean, it's right on the Mediterranean. It's the kind of places that anywhere else would have all kinds of beaches and, tourist attractions, etc. But because of Israeli policy, it's been, impoverished over the years. So what they did is they put the squeeze by not allowing basic construction supplies and food, and they allowed in just a very bare amount of stuff for survival. And the Egyptians cooperated on the Rafah side. There's 2 ways into Gaza. One is through Egypt, one is through Israel. And you couldn't get most things in or out. And the sewage plant broke down and the electricity broke down. It was really horrific living conditions for the Palestinians living in Gaza. And then, of course, they attacked Gaza. The Palestinians were firing homemade rockets and mortars into Israel. Israel said that was the provocation to justify them coming in with 2,000-pound bombs and rockets, killing civilians. So this whole issue of who's a terrorist becomes kind of highlighted, because if a Palestinian fires a rocket at a civilian town in Israel, that's terrorism. But if Israel fires a rocket on an apartment building in Gaza, that's legitimate self-defense. So the level of hypocrisy is highly known. The conditions got a little bit better in Gaza after the Turkish flotilla incident. They had to lift things a little bit, but it's still very horrific, inhuman conditions in Gaza.
The next member of the audience asked the author which of the many people he had interviewed had the greatest impact on his opinion or knowledge or understanding of a particular situation that he was covering.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a very good one. Because I've been doing this for like 42 years. so my hard drive is spinning at the moment. And not only that, I not only interview political leaders, but I write about jazz. So just to throw a curve at you, I interviewed Wayne Shorter. I've interviewed Chucho Valdez from the great Cuban musician. Those folks have actually had a very big impact on me just because they're such wonderful people. But that's not really what you're interested in, is it? Certainly the interview with Bashar al-Assad had a huge impact. I was really fascinated by Ayatollah Fadlallah, actually. Here was a guy, he's a Lebanese cleric. He passed away last year, but he was a Lebanese cleric who was accused of being a terrorist and masterminding the Marine Corps bombing in Lebanon in 1985. Remember when somebody blew up and the U.S. claimed it was Fadlallah, and then they blew up an apartment building to try and kill Fadlallah and killed 80 people in Beirut in a terrorist bombing sponsored by the CIA. And then it turned out Fadlallah didn't have anything to do with it in the first place. So him retelling that story and the fact that he was known throughout Lebanon as a guy who was actually a pretty liberal-minded cleric. So my favorite incident was that one of the things he had done is he had issued a fatwa, or a religious ruling, against smoking. Now, if you've been in the Middle East, everybody smokes. Everybody smokes, right? So I asked him, I said, a cleric can issue a fatwa, but will people carry it out? Will the people follow it? And his room, we were in a room, like 20 of his supporters were lining the room. They were all smoking. And and that was, my comment was translated, and they all threw down their stubbing out, putting out their cigarettes. And he goes, some of my fatwas are followed more closely than others. Or words to that effect. All right, so the first part was, it wasn't the Green Movement in Iran that erupted in 2009, different from what's going on in Tunisia and Egypt, because in Iran, the government is anti-U.S., and the movement seemed to be like the other color revolutions in Ukraine or Georgia and so on. Okay, no, to give this sort of simplest answer. And I wrote, actually, there's a chapter in my book where you can go into great detail about this. But I have heard this argument, and I've had this discussion with people. Yeah. And I wrote a commentary, actually, that got a lot of web circulation right at the time when it happened. Ahmadinejad is a phony anti-imperialist. He uses anti-imperialist rhetoric to promote his own interests. He wants to be more of a leader in a pan-Islamic movement throughout the Middle East that has nothing in common with what I would argue would be genuine anti-imperialism. The proof of, Fidel Castro, for example, criticized him for being anti-Semitic, for denying the Holocaust. There's a whole series of things that actually put him, well, he questioned it. I know exactly what he said because I've read it in great detail. He questioned the Holocaust. And those who question it, it's a reality, and it's an excuse. It's like those who question whether creationism should be taught as a science. It's a way to slip in your viewpoint without having to actually adopt the position. The people of Iran rose up in a spontaneous mass demonstration that wasn't controlled by anybody. It wasn't controlled by the CIA. It was not pro-U.S. despite all the propaganda that we got here. I was there. I saw it. I interacted with people. There were people who were really, really angry at the lack of democracy and the stealing of the vote, but underlying it were all the economic grievances. Working people came out, clerics came out, soldiers in plainclothes came out. It was a multi-class movement, particularly in the first few weeks and months of it before it got repressed. And they had the same economic, once you got beyond the immediate issues of the election, it's all the same issues that you see in Tunisia and Egypt, because they were angry at the neoliberal policies being carried out by Ahmadinejad in the name of Islam and in the name of anti-imperialism. He's quadrupled gasoline prices. He's taken away subsidies. He's applied a neoliberal model to Iran, but done it in a very slick way. Now, the second question was about the WikiLeaks for Palestinians. Al Jazeera. No, I know. I'm teasing. I put that in quotes. It's the Al Jazeera got a hold of some internal documents from the negotiators, the Palestinian negotiators, in which it was revealed they had proposed concessions to Israel, including dealing with the right of return, including giving up key locations in East Jerusalem. And I think the Palestinians were outraged at that. It's not surprising in that some of those kinds of concessions had been floated previously, but to see it, just like with the WikiLeaks stuff, when you see it actually coming out of the mouths of the ambassadors, or in this case, actually coming out of the mouths of the negotiators, they're pretty mad. I think it's going to make it even more difficult for those folks to negotiate, but those negotiations are dead anyway. And without the participation of Hamas and more pressure on Israel, they ain't going anywhere anyway. So it's revelatory, but it's not going to be decisive.
The next member of the audience asked whether the author thought that the uprisings might spread to the Palestinian territories.
No, the Palestinian situation is very different. If they're going to rise up, they're going to rise up against Israel. They have an occupier.
The next member of the audience asked how U.S. policy was likely to affect countries like Somalia.
Countries like Somalia. Oh, boy. Okay, here we go. Next is Sudan. I know. There's somebody out there. How does the U.S. policy affect Somalia? Somalia is again, I have not visited Somalia. I would love to go there once I could get out again. It's a very dangerous place. For a long time, Somalia was run by a pro-U.S. dictator. So everything was stable and the U.S. was happy, and you just had kind of your run-of-the-mill, evil, human rights violating dictatorship, right? The government changed. It flipped back and forth at different times during the Cold War and became kind of a little bit more friendly to the Soviet Union, and other times a little bit more friendly to the U.S., et cetera. Then at a certain point, the government just collapsed altogether. I'm obviously giving a very short history here. And it's been a non-functioning government for a long time. The Ethiopians invaded for a while. They couldn't stay. They couldn't occupy the country any more than anybody else. You've got the official government that's recognized by the West. I think they occupy like a hotel room or something. You're right. I think they're down to like a hotel room and a stop sign somewhere in Mogadishu. But they're propped up by the United States. And there's troops there. There's African troops there, and so on. The other folks, the insurgents, some of whom are, as best as I can figure out, some of the strain of these ultra-conservative forces using Islam as an excuse to put themselves into power. And, of course, the U.S. opposes them, but they want to have a pro-U.S. dictator in power. But I think maybe people here know more than I, if there are Somalis here or people who follow this more closely than I do. I think it's going to be an extremely difficult situation for a while. I think all the factions are going to keep fighting for a while. And the U.S. is not able to impose its will on the country, but neither has its force been defeated.
The next member of the audience commented that the size of the Israeli state was comparable to the state of Oregon.
I don't know how big Oregon is. I'm from California. Yeah. I mean, Israel is I'm not quite sure your point. Okay. Israel is smaller than Oregon.
The next member of the audience observed that Jim Gant has put out a paper describing the so-called tribal engagement strategy in Afghanistan. This member of the audience asked the author if he was aware of any strategy for moving forward in Afghanistan along tribal engagement lines politically, beyond the logical step of throwing the Karzai crony bums out. Who do we put in? This audience member asked.
Yeah. The first thing is it's not up to us to put somebody in. It is. It's. There's no question about it that it's a very difficult political situation of who's going to ultimately run Afghanistan. My view is the U.S. has to get the troops out yesterday. And because it's a losing war, we're killing Afghan civilians at a horrendous rate. American soldiers are dying at a horrendous rate. And 5 years from now, pouring in another 100,000 troops is not going to make any difference. Sooner or later, the U.S. is going to have to get out, and there's going to have to be a political settlement. So tribal engagement was one version of trying to undermine the Karzai government, or go around, maybe a better way to phrase it would be go around the Karzai government to establish pro-U.S. support among the tribes. I think we're beyond that, because whatever the U.S. might have been able to do in the beginning, it's 10 years into the war, we're seen as the occupying force. And there's nothing, once you're established as the occupying force, there's nothing that can be done to turn that around. I think the best that we can expect is U.S. troops pull out, some kind of a negotiated political settlement between Karzai, the Haqqani group, the Hekmatyar forces, and the Taliban. Those are the three insurgent groups in Afghanistan. They have some kind of a coalition government. The Al-Qaeda will not be allowed to operate off of there for very pragmatic reasons, which is they're afraid of a U.S. attack, but more precisely because they can operate more freely in Pakistan, which is they're operating from. They don't need Afghanistan anymore. They are operating very nicely out of Pakistan, thank you. It's a more developed country. They got better phones, et cetera. And they will do that. And I think the best that we could hope for is that the horrific destruction of Afghanistan stops, and that there's a stable government. Over time, the people of Afghanistan will have to resolve all of the very, very difficult issues that they face. But the U.S. cannot impose a solution any more than the Soviet Union could.
The next member of the audience asked again about the situation of the Palestinians in the occupied territories.
Yeah, you see, it's much more common. When I said before that the Palestinians have an enemy, they have an occupier, and that's Israel, that makes the situation much more complicated, because in Tunisia or Egypt you have an indigenous evil government that has actual power, and they're rising up against the dictatorship and the military in their country. In the case of Palestine, the Palestinians realize that the Palestinian Authority, for all the venal things and corrupt things they do, they don't have the real power. It's Israel that has the real power. So you rise up against the PA, and what have you got? More Israeli troops. So it's a different dynamic. So yes, I share and I agree with what you're saying. There's a lot of people very angry at Fatah for the way they're running things, and I'm sure the release of these papers have made people even angrier. And there may even be demonstrations, but there's a very different dynamic. And I think if change happens, it'll be a change in the leadership as a younger generation, a more radical generation of Palestinian leaders within the PLO come to the fore. I think that would be the nature of the change.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
You've been listening to journalist and author Reese Erlich talking about his latest book, Conversations with Terrorists, Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free, on-demand, streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. You can also find our channels on the YouTube and Vimeo video sharing websites. And you can access the PDX Justice channel on Vimeo through web TV services such as Netflix Instant View, which allow you to stream these programs direct to your television. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.